Certainly at the moment the traffic is considerably less in both Melbourne and Sydney, which are the most heavily congested cities in Australia. In fact, I'm in Sydney today and speaking to the driver that I had this morning, he was saying that it only took him 40 minutes to get from Western Sydney into the CBD in peak hour this morning, when it ordinarily would take him an hour and 10 minutes. So that's an indication of present. In the future, it's very difficult to predict. I mean, there's a real opportunity here, I think, Tom, for some of the flexibility in working arrangements to continue. We want people to back to work, but they may be able to do so more flexibly, which may mean less traffic on the roads on an ongoing basis.
And so when you say ongoing, we're talking about beyond COVID-19. Let's imagine a wonderful world in which there's a vaccine and we're not talking about this dreaded thing anymore. How would that work? Would we have a national framework? You know, if you're talking about a certain type of office job, the employer has to offer split shifts. People can either go 7 to 3 or 10 to 6. They get one day, maybe a fortnight where they can work from home. Do we need a real framework to make this happen rather than just saying, hey, that was a great idea, keep doing it if you want to?
Yeah, I'm not convinced that we do need a national framework as such. I think employers will respond to the desires of employees who, in many cases, want to work more flexibly. And if their productivity is the same, then it's probably good for the employee, which makes it good for the employer as well, if that productivity is maintained. And so there might also be, from the employer's perspective, the less need for as much property in some of the really expensive areas, such as the CBDs or some of the other employment centres. So there might be benefits from the employer perspective as well in terms of lower costs if there's flexible working arrangements. I actually do think this will work itself out over the next 6, 12, 24 months, where more flexible arrangements will become more of the norm amongst those employment relationships.
Right, so you think that, and yes, you've outlined pretty clear incentive from a financial point of view. That always helps convince business. But if it just returns to normal and our streets are just as clogged and your poor drivers doing the hour 10 plus from Western Sydney, do we look at a framework? I mean, we're all talking about the National Cabinet and people willing to cooperate now. Surely there'd be an easy conversation to have if people are still willing to, you know, be better than the old COAG. Is it something you'd look at?
I think the National Cabinet has certainly worked exceptionally well throughout this period, and I think there's been some arguments already made that this should continue. But the question about do you need a national framework to govern that flexible arrangements, I'm not convinced, but ultimately this would be more of a decision for the Industrial Relations Minister in that regard as well. I suppose what I'm more concerned about actually, Tom, in terms of congestion, at least in the short term, is more on public transport. Now, our major cities, and particularly if I focus on Melbourne and Sydney, are still very car dependent. About 80% of all travel in Melbourne is done by cars. In Sydney, it's about 2/3. But certainly of the people who work in the CBD, those figures are almost reversed. So about 3/4 of people who work in the CBD use public transport, and about 2/3 in Melbourne use public transport to get there. And obviously the capacity of public transport is lower because of the social distancing. And I think that presents challenges which we have to think carefully about and work through over the months and years ahead.
And well, we've known this for a little while. The New South Wales plan out just the other day included a limit of 12 on buses, but also a direction for no one to be refused entry onto a bus. That doesn't appear to make any sense at all, does it?
I personally didn't quite understand that one. I can appreciate maybe from a bus driver's perspective that they may be concerned about their potentially they're concerned about their safety if they're having to be policing that as well. But that's really a matter for the state government in terms of how they negotiate those things. I think they're good rules in terms of ensuring that we can still travel on public transport in a safe way. and that's the most important thing. But clearly the capacity of those buses will be down. Clearly the capacity of the trains will be down. And many of those trains in Melbourne and Sydney, and certainly in Melbourne, were already at crush capacity in the morning. So you take out half the capacity effectively, and it does mean some of that demand will go on the roads, and maybe that will offset what we're talking about before in terms of the flexible arrangements.
Right.
So I think it's a little bit of
But this is the worry for people out there. Maybe,
Yeah,
but is there a bit of a concern for people out there? We're just not ready for it at the moment. And even on trains, when the green sticker theory in Sydney is great, but you've got to get on the train, look around, oh, there's no sticker, the doors are closed, you're on the train. I mean, it just doesn't seem like it's a workable policy yet.
Yeah, I think the intent is certainly there, and I admire the intent to be able to, for people to be able to commute safely on public transport. The operational aspects of that are obviously up to the state governments. And so I'll leave it to them to work that out. But as I said, at the moment we've probably got pressures on public transport because of that, but we've got less pressure certainly at the moment on the roads, simply because so many people are still being able to work from home.
Just finally, Property Council sounding the alarm on prices, and part of its solution, it says, might need to be an immigration campaign encouraging people to come to Australia once the worst of the crisis has ended. Is that something you'd be up for? Maybe a new twist on the where the bloody hell are you campaign?
Australia's always a very desirable destination, Tom, so I don't think that we will have problems in terms of attracting people. If anything, I think we'll be even more desirable in the future once immigration is back open again, because we've done so well in relation to the virus against some of our competitor countries, certainly. That may be the case for international students, it may be the case for migrants more generally. I think there's real opportunity, by the way, to actually get even higher calibre of migrants come into Australia than we ordinarily do. We already do exceptionally well in that regard in terms of getting high-skilled people.
Does that mean changing the rules, Alan Tudge? Is that an indication of changing the rules?
It may not mean that, but I just think that the desirability of Australia may be actually enhanced in the future, and consequently we'll be able to get or continue to get exceptionally high calibre people coming in. Obviously, this is a question for the future, though, Tom. I mean, our focus very much has been on closing the borders and maintaining the security of those borders, because that's been probably the single most important thing that we've done in terms of getting control of the virus, because about 2/3 of all the cases were coming in from across the borders, from Aussies returning or for international people coming into the country.